Late 1950s. A winter night in Harlem. Snow falling on 125th Street, turning to slush under the feet of people who couldn't afford proper boots. Outside a crumbling tenement building, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stood with his hands in his coat pockets, his breath visible in the freezing air. Behind him, tenants gathered, mothers holding children wrapped in thin blankets, fathers who worked double shifts but still couldn't keep the heat on, grandmothers who'd seen too many winters without radiators that worked. The most feared man in Harlem was about to do something nobody expected. Not with guns, not with threats, not with the violence that had built his empire, with rent strikes. The man who'd made a fortune running illegal gambling was about to become Harlem's most unlikely union organizer. And what he did next would change how the community fought back against a system designed to bleed them dry. This is the story of when Harlem's most dangerous criminal became its most effective community organizer, and why maybe nobody could tell the difference. By the late 1950s, Harlem tenants faced a housing crisis that would have been illegal if anyone had cared enough to enforce the law. Picture this: 6 families crammed into apartments built for 2. Plaster crumbling off walls where rats had made permanent homes, radiators that clanked all night but never produced heat. Children sleeping in winter coats because the landlord, who lived in Westchester and had never once set foot in the buildings he owned, refused to fix the boiler. And for this privilege, tenants paid rents that consumed half their income, sometimes more. The numbers tell part of the story. According to housing records from the period, Harlem's tenements housed 3 times the people they were designed for. But numbers don't convey the mother trying to keep her baby warm when it's 30 degrees inside. They don't capture the man who worked as a porter 6 days a week, but still had to choose between rent and food every single month. This wasn't an accident. This was the slumlord system working exactly as designed. Here's how it worked. Wealthy white investors bought Harlem buildings cheap during the Depression. As the Great Migration brought thousands of black families north, desperate for housing anywhere they could find it, these landlords saw opportunity. They subdivided apartments, raised rents to exploit the desperation, and spent exactly $0 on maintenance. Housing code violations, barely enforced, tenant complaints, filed in folders that nobody ever opened. Broken heating, leaking pipes, electrical fires waiting to happen, all technically illegal, all completely ignored by a city government that simply didn't care what happened in Harlem. Charging triple rent for a freezing apartment wasn't illegal. Letting children live with rats wasn't illegal. What was illegal, according to the courts, was refusing to pay. You see the paradox? The system called exploitation business and called resistance crime. Tenants tried everything legal first. They organized tenant associations, held meetings in church basements, typed careful letters to the housing department. They filled out complaint forms in triplicate. They waited for inspectors who never came. When inspectors occasionally did show up, landlords got advance warning, plenty of time to make cosmetic repairs, just enough to pass inspection. The day after the inspector left, the heat went off again. Some tried taking landlords to housing court. But housing court required lawyers, and lawyers required money, and money was exactly what tenants didn't have after paying rent. The few cases that actually made it before a judge usually ended the same way. Tenant ordered to pay rent anyway. Landlord promised to make repairs, eventually, repairs never happening. The legal system wasn't designed to help Harlem tenants. It was designed to protect the landlords who were bleeding them. So when every legal door is closed, what's left? That's when Harlem started looking for someone who understood how to fight outside the law. Someone who had infrastructure, someone who had resources, someone the landlords actually feared, someone like Bumpy Johnson. According to Harlem old-timers, the people who remember when Bumpy walked 125th Street like he owned it, which in some ways he did, the rent strike happened because Bumpy's criminal organization had something tenant associations didn't: infrastructure. Think about what a union organizer needs: a network that reaches every workplace, daily contact with workers, a communication system faster than management's, resources to support workers during strikes, and most importantly, the ability to enforce solidarity, to make sure nobody breaks the picket line. Bumpy had all of that. He just got it through running the numbers game instead of collecting union dues. The numbers game, illegal lottery where Harlemites bet pennies on three-digit numbers, touched every building in Harlem. Not because Bumpy forced it. Because when banks won't give you loans, when legitimate businesses won't hire you, when the entire legal economy is designed to exclude you, an illegal lottery starts looking like the only financial system that actually includes you. Harlem played the numbers the way white Americans played the stock market. Same principle, different law, and Bumpy's network of numbers runners, they were everywhere. Every morning, runners collected bets building by building, apartment by apartment. Every evening, they returned with payouts. They knew every tenant. They were trusted, more trusted than any outside organizer could ever be. Because they were neighbors, cousins, church members. When your numbers runner came by, you didn't just hand over your bet, you talked about your day, your job, your landlord, your broken radiator. The story people tell is this: Bumpy didn't decide to organize a rent strike through some grand political awakening. He saw an opportunity to leverage what he already had. His numbers runners could become building captains. Their daily collection routes could become information networks. The same system that spread word about winning numbers could spread word about rent strikes. And the money that flowed through the numbers game, money that stayed in Harlem, circulated through Harlem, could become a strike fund to help families who couldn't afford to withhold rent. In traditional union organizing, shop stewards hold meetings, distribute flyers, coordinate action. In Bumpy's version, numbers runners did the same thing. They just did it while collecting bets. When your numbers runner tells you, building on a 103 First Street stopped paying rent, whole building, every tenant, and the landlord can't evict everyone, you listen. When he tells you, Bumpy's people will help with food if you need it, you believe him. And when he suggests, quietly, that maybe your building should be next, you don't dismiss it as crazy. Because here's what tenants knew. Bumpy's network had enforced solidarity before. If someone tried to muscle in on the numbers operation, Bumpy's organization made sure they understood that wasn't acceptable. If someone informed to the police, they learned that betraying the community had consequences. Was that criminal intimidation? Absolutely. But was it also the exact kind of enforcement mechanism that makes strikes work? That keeps scabs from crossing picket lines? That ensures everyone holds together when the bosses push back? Also, yes, the resources were equally important. When workers strike, they lose wages. They need a strike fund. Money pooled together to buy food, pay bills, keep families afloat while they hold out. Traditional unions collect dues for exactly this purpose. Bumpy's numbers game generated cash. Lots of it. And according to Bumpy Johnson's memoir, Bumpy regularly used that money to help people in the community, paying medical bills, funeral costs, rent for families in crisis. What if he organized that into something systematic? What if winning numbers players understood that part of the payout supported a community fund? What if illegal gambling money became the strike fund that legal institutions refused to create? Was this organized crime or organized labor? The way Harlem tells it, maybe it was both. Maybe the only difference was which side of the law you were operating from. And maybe, when the law itself is rigged against you, that distinction stops meaning much. Here's what made Bumpy different from a traditional union organizer. He didn't need to convince landlords to negotiate. He needed landlords to understand that exploitation in Bumpy's Harlem came with risks, the kind of risk you don't get from tenant associations writing polite letters. Did he threaten violence? The historical record doesn't document specific threats. But Bumpy's reputation, earned through years of enforcing territorial control in Harlem's underworld, did the work for him. When landlords heard that Bumpy Johnson was backing a rent strike, they didn't shrug it off the way they shrugged off housing inspectors. They paid attention. So Harlem's criminal infrastructure became movement infrastructure. The same network that ran illegal gambling ran community organizing. And the question nobody could quite answer, was that wrong? Ask the families who finally got heat. The way the story is told in Harlem, passed down through generations, embellished maybe, but carrying the emotional truth, even if some details have blurred, the rent strike began with one building and spread like fire through dry kindling. Whether every detail is true, nobody alive can say for certain. But this is how Harlem remembers the fight. Week 1. The announcement. It started at a tenant meeting in someone's cramped living room. 20 people packed shoulder to shoulder, children sent to neighbors so adults could talk. Bumpy wasn't there himself. He rarely showed up to things like this, preferring to work through intermediaries, but one of his people was. The representative laid out the plan. Simple, direct, almost brutally so. Next rent day, nobody pays. Not one person in this building. All of us together, same day. The room went quiet. Somebody finally asked the obvious question. What about eviction? Landlord can evict one family, maybe two, the representative said. Can't evict 40 families. Courts are too slow. He'd lose more in empty apartments and legal fees than he'd gain trying to force it. Plus, word gets out he's mass evicting in Harlem. Other buildings might get ideas. The logic made sense. But logic doesn't overcome fear easily. A mother with 3 children spoke up. What if we lose? What if we end up on the street? This was when Bumpy's network showed its value. The representative explained, strike fund. Families who absolutely couldn't manage would get help with food, emergency costs. Not charity, solidarity. You hold out, we hold you up. First moral question, hanging unspoken in the cigarette smoke. Is refusing to pay rent theft? Or is charging triple rent for a freezing apartment with rats the real theft? The vote wasn't unanimous. Fear rarely allows unanimity. But it was enough. One building, one rent day, one collective act of refusal. Week 2, first rent day, when the landlord's rent collector arrived, a man who'd been making this route for years, who knew every tenant by name and never showed them an ounce of sympathy, he found something unprecedented. Nobody paid. The collector went door to door, knocked, waited, got the same answer from every apartment. Not this month. Some apologetic, some defiant, but all unified in refusal. The tension was electric. What would happen? Police? Eviction notices? Landlord sending thugs? Rumor says Bumpy was there, standing quiet in the corner of the ground floor hallway. Didn't say a word, didn't need to. His presence asked the question for him. You really want to start something here? The collector left with an empty envelope, and word spread. Tenants in the next building over heard about it. Then the building across the street, then the entire block. Each conversation started the same way. Did you hear what they did on 141st? By the end of week 2, 3 more buildings had contacted Bumpy's network. They wanted in. Weeks 3 and 4. The expansion, the rent strike spread building by building, block by block. Not every building joined. Fear kept many in line. But enough did to create something landlords hadn't seen before. Organized, coordinated resistance across multiple properties. Landlords fought back the way landlords always fight back. Eviction notices. Legal letters delivered to every door, threatening court action, promising to make examples of anyone who continued withholding rent. Tenants responded with their own legal tactic: delay. The few legal aid lawyers available to Harlem, overworked, underpaid, but committed, filed motions, requested hearings, demanded documentation that landlords couldn't immediately produce. Each delay bought more time. And time was what the strike needed. Meanwhile, Bumpy's network did what networks do: circulated information, provided support, maintained solidarity. Strike fund money helped families most desperate. Not much, there was never enough money for not much, but something. Enough to buy milk, enough to pay the utility bill, enough to prove that holding together was possible. Numbers runners spread news about which buildings were joining, which landlords were cracking, which city officials were taking notice. Information moved faster through the numbers network than through any newspaper, and Harlem felt something it hadn't felt in a long time: unity. Churches held meetings to support strikers. Neighbors shared food with neighbors. People who'd lived on the same block for years but barely spoke to each other now coordinated. Small acts of solidarity compounded into community cohesion. One old woman, interviewed years later, remembered it this way: Harlem hadn't felt that together since Marcus Garvey was marching, maybe not even then. Because this wasn't about following a leader, this was us taking care of each other. Weeks 5 and 6. The crisis point. Landlords escalated. If legal pressure wouldn't break the strike, maybe physical pressure would. Heat got cut. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious, but maintenance issues that coincidentally affected every striking building. Boilers broke, pipes leaked, repairs could happen, landlords said once rent was paid. Some landlords went further, water shut off. Again, maintenance. Again, coincidentally affecting only strikers, and some hired muscle. Thugs showed up at buildings, not quite threatening violence but making their presence known. Intimidation, calculated to terrify. This was when Bumpy's role, according to oral histories, became less ambiguous. The thugs didn't return after the first visit. Nobody talks much about what happened to convince them to leave. That's the nature of Harlem's memory. Some things are known but not spoken. But the thugs stopped coming. And space heaters purchased with strike fund money appeared in apartments where heat had been cut. Here's the moral complexity moment that makes this story so difficult to categorize. Was Bumpy threatening landlords' hired muscle? Almost certainly. Was that wrong? Ask the children who finally had heat. Ask the mothers who didn't have to choose between rent and food that month. The criminal methods served a righteous cause, and Harlem had to reckon with what that meant. Press attention started trickling in. Small newspaper items in white papers, written with condescension. Harlem tenants refuse rent in protest. No mention of why. No mention of frozen children or rat-infested apartments or landlords collecting triple rent for slum conditions. But even negative press created pressure. Landlords who preferred operating in shadows found their names in newspapers. City officials who'd ignored Harlem for decades started getting questions they didn't want to answer. Public opinion in Harlem was complex. Even people who hated the numbers game, church leaders who'd preached against gambling for years, couldn't quite condemn what Bumpy's network had organized. The man had a point, they admitted privately. Publicly, they said nothing, which in Harlem was its own form of endorsement. Weeks 7 and 8, the breaking point. By week 7, landlords faced math they couldn't ignore. Lost rent was piling up. Not from one tenant they could evict, but from entire buildings they couldn't afford to empty. Legal costs were mounting. Every delay tactic the legal aid lawyers deployed cost landlords money. Court dates kept getting pushed. Eviction processes that should have taken weeks were stretching into months. Worse, from the landlord's perspective, other Harlem buildings were watching. If this strike succeeded, how many more would join? How much more rent would they lose? The calculation shifted. Cut losses now or risk a larger rebellion later? Negotiation didn't happen in any official capacity. There were no union representatives at a bargaining table, no contracts signed, no formal mediation. This was Harlem in the 1950s. Formal processes weren't available to people the system pretended didn't exist. Instead, landlords started making deals building by building. Quiet agreements, nothing on paper. Rent would come down. Not to fair levels, never to fair levels, but down from the exploitation peak. Repairs would happen. Actual repairs, not cosmetic temporary fixes. Boilers would be replaced, pipes would be fixed, and no retaliation evictions. Tenants who'd struck wouldn't be forced out once rent resumed. Not every landlord agreed. Some held out, tried to wait out the strike. But enough agreed to create momentum. Enough agreed that striking tenants could claim victory, at least partial victory. The resolution. By late winter, repairs began. Landlords grudgingly started complying. Some kept their word fully. Others did the minimum. But tenants who'd lived through previous winters without heat now had working radiators. That mattered. Rents came down. Not to affordable, nothing in Harlem was truly affordable, but lower than the peak exploitation. Families who'd been choosing between rent and food could sometimes afford both, and nobody was evicted for striking. That may have been the biggest win. Community solidarity had held firm enough to protect everyone who'd participated. Was it a complete victory? No. The system didn't change. The underlying structure of exploitation, housing discrimination, racist lending, city neglect, remained intact. This was one battle won in a war that had no end in sight. But tenants had proven something. They could fight back. Together they had power. Bumpy Johnson never took credit publicly. He didn't need to. Harlem knew, and the landlords knew. Whatever else Bumpy was, he'd just shown them that exploiting his community came with costs they hadn't calculated before. In the buildings where the strike had held, where tenants had unified, withheld rent, endured pressure, and won concessions, life improved. Marginally, temporarily, but measurably. Repairs happened. Families slept warmer. Children got sick less often. The small victories of basic dignity, heat, water, walls without holes, felt enormous to people who'd been denied them. Rent stayed lower, for a while, until landlords found new ways to raise it, new justifications, new methods. But for those months, families had a little breathing room, a little money left over, not much, but something. And tenants felt something they hadn't felt before, power and solidarity. They'd stood together and won. Not everything they wanted, not permanently, but won nonetheless. The story spread through Harlem faster than any newspaper could have carried it. Other buildings heard what happened on 131st Street, on 125th, on 145th, and they started asking questions, started organizing, started believing that collective resistance was possible. Whether Bumpy's strike directly inspired later movements, nobody can say for certain, but the tradition of tenant organizing in Harlem did grow. By the 1960s, documented rent strikes led by activists like Jesse Gray would make national news, forcing city officials to finally confront housing conditions they'd ignored for generations. Those later strikes used similar tactics, building by building organizing, strike funds, solidarity enforcement. The blueprint was there. Whether Bumpy drew it or simply contributed to it, Harlem remembered resistance works when people hold together. But here's what didn't change. The systemic issues that created the crisis in the first place remained untouched. Housing discrimination continued through the 1960s and beyond. Banks still redlined black neighborhoods. Landlords still exploited desperation. City officials still allocated resources to white neighborhoods while neglecting Harlem. One rent strike couldn't fix structural racism. Bumpy's network, powerful as it was in Harlem, couldn't scale to challenge citywide policy, statewide law, nationwide discrimination. His methods worked where he had power, in his community, among people who knew him, in buildings where his reputation carried weight. But systemic change requires systemic solutions, and criminal networks, however effective at local resistance, can't provide those. There's an uncomfortable truth in that limitation. Bumpy could organize a rent strike, but he couldn't end redlining. He could force landlords to make repairs, but he couldn't change laws. He could protect his community from the worst exploitation, but he couldn't dismantle the machinery of exploitation itself. Not because he lacked will or intelligence or resources, because one man, one network, one community acting alone can't overcome structures designed to oppress millions. The rent strike was a battle won. The war continued. Fast forward to today, 70 years after Bumpy's supposed organizing. New York City faces a rent crisis that would feel familiar to 1950s Harlem tenants. Families still pay 50% or more of income for housing. Corporate landlords, LLCs hiding ownership, algorithms calculating maximum extractable rent, exploit desperation with mathematical precision. Eviction proceedings still favor landlords, legal aid remains underfunded, and communities still organize rent strikes as a last resort when legal channels fail. Different buildings, different decade, same battle. Harlem specifically faces gentrification now, a different kind of displacement, but displacement nonetheless. Longtime residents priced out as property values climb. Cultural landmarks replaced by luxury condos. The community that Bumpy fought to protect, now fighting to simply stay in place. Current rent strikes in New York City use similar tactics to those Harlem oral histories describe: building by building organizing, strike funds, solidarity enforcement. Technology changed, WhatsApp groups instead of numbers runners, but the fundamental strategy remains the same. Which raises uncomfortable questions. If we're still fighting these battles 70 years later, what did we actually learn? What changed? Really? We got laws. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 banned housing discrimination. Tenant rights expanded, at least on paper. Legal aid organizations grew, though never enough to meet demand. But laws without enforcement are just words on paper, and enforcement requires political will, and political will requires power, and power, in a system designed to concentrate it among the wealthy, remains out of reach for the people who need it most. Maybe that's what hasn't changed. We're still more comfortable with legal injustice than illegal justice. We'll tolerate systemic exploitation as long as it follows proper procedures. But we'll condemn resistance the moment it breaks rules we claim are sacred. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968. The problems he fought outlived him. Because Bumpy wasn't the problem, he was a symptom of a system that forced communities to choose between legal exploitation and illegal protection. That system is still here. So what do we call Bumpy Johnson? The traditional categories don't fit. Criminal who helped his community? Community organizer who broke laws? Hero who used violence? Villain who protected children? Both? Neither. Something we don't have words for because our language assumes heroes and villains occupy separate categories? Maybe the question itself is wrong. Maybe we should be asking, why did Harlem need a criminal to do what unions, what legal institutions, what the entire structure of American democracy should have done? But first, let's be honest about both sides. The case against Bumpy starts with the facts we can't dispute. The numbers game was illegal gambling. That's not interpretation, that's law. And illegal gambling, like all gambling, exploits patterns of addiction. Not everyone who played numbers was addicted, but some were. Some people bet money they needed for food, for rent, for medicine. The system Bumpy ran took money from people who could least afford to lose it. No matter how you frame community circulation of capital, no matter how you compare it favorably to banks that refused to serve Harlem, the numbers game was still built on people losing money they didn't have. That caused harm. Violence existed in Bumpy's world too. Territorial disputes over gambling operations, enforcement of debts, protection of territory. People got hurt. People got killed. That's the nature of criminal enterprise. When legal systems won't enforce your agreements, violence becomes the currency of enforcement. Just because the cause was sometimes righteous doesn't mean the methods weren't criminal. Threatening landlords' muscle is still intimidation. Using fear to enforce solidarity is still coercion. And there's the paternalism problem. Community organizing should be democratic, people making collective decisions about collective action. But Bumpy's network wasn't democratic. It was hierarchical. Decisions flowed down from the top. Tenants who participated in the rent strike were dependent on Bumpy's resources, Bumpy's protection, Bumpy's willingness to sustain the fight. What happens when the benevolent dictator decides the community isn't worth protecting anymore? What happens when his interests diverge from theirs? That's not liberation. That's substituting one form of control for another. These criticisms are real. They deserve acknowledgement. Any honest accounting of Bumpy's legacy has to include the harm his criminal enterprise caused. The case. For Bumpy, but now consider the context. Where else could Harlem get capital? Banks redlined, black neighborhoods, documented policy, not speculation. Refused loans for homes, businesses, development, systematically extracted wealth from black communities while refusing to invest in them. The numbers game kept money circulating within Harlem. When someone won, that money stayed in the community. Compare that to banks that took deposits from Harlem and invested them in white neighborhoods. Which system actually served the community better? Illegal? Yes. But more harmful than the legal exploitation banks engaged in? That's a harder question to answer. Violence in Bumpy's world was real. But so was police violence against Harlem. So was the violence of housing discrimination, of poverty, of children dying from preventable diseases because hospitals turned them away. At least Bumpy's violence had rules, boundaries, logic. You knew what would trigger it. You knew how to avoid it. You couldn't say the same about police who beat people for being in the wrong neighborhood or landlords who let children freeze. Not good, not justified. But measured against the alternatives actually available, may be better than what the legal system offered. The rent strike tactics, threatening landlords, intimidating their muscle, using fear to maintain solidarity, were criminal, no question. But legal tactics had failed for decades. Petitions were ignored. Complaints were dismissed. Housing court protected landlords. So the question becomes, if legal avenues are deliberately closed, if the system is designed to make legal resistance impossible, is illegal resistance wrong? Landlords ignored tenant associations. They laughed at polite letters. They knew housing inspectors wouldn't enforce code violations, but they didn't ignore Bumpy. They couldn't afford to. Results matter. Families got heat. Children slept in warm beds. Rent came down. Those outcomes came from illegal methods, yes, but they came after decades of legal methods producing nothing. If the system won't protect you, is protection from outside the system criminal? As for the paternalism criticism, that's valid. Bumpy's network wasn't democratic, but neither was the system that oppressed Harlem. At least Bumpy's paternalism directed resources toward the community instead of extracting them. At least his authority came with responsibility. Landlords had authority over tenants without any reciprocal obligation. Bumpy's control came with protection. Again, not ideal, not what anyone would choose in a just system. But measured against what Harlem actually faced, maybe not worse. The systemic reframe. But maybe we're asking the wrong question, not was Bumpy good or bad, but why did the community need Bumpy? Step back from individual moral judgment and look at structural failure, housing policy, redlining, discriminatory lending, segregation enforced by federal mortgage insurance programs. These weren't accidents. These were deliberate policies designed to concentrate black families in specific neighborhoods, limit their mobility, cap their wealth accumulation. Legal system, housing courts that sided with landlords as default practice. Judges who treated tenant complaints as nuisances. Eviction processes designed for speed, not justice. Laws on the books protecting tenants, but enforcement mechanisms that didn't exist. Political power, Harlem's representation in city government minimal. Resources allocated to white neighborhoods. Infrastructure investment stopped at Harlem's borders. Community concerns dismissed by officials who didn't have to answer to black voters. Economic access. Banks refused capital. Businesses refused service. Job opportunities limited by discrimination so systematic it didn't need to be spoken. Everyone just knew where black people could and couldn't work. Police. They didn't protect Harlem. They occupied it. Brutality was policy. Harassment was routine. The law enforcement system served to control the community, not serve it. Every legitimate institution failed Harlem. Every legal avenue for redress was blocked. Every democratic process was compromised by systemic racism. When every legitimate institution fails a community, who fills the gap? Bumpy didn't create the need for extra legal protection. The system did. The system that criminalized black survival while legalizing black exploitation. The system that made illegal gambling more accessible to Harlem than legal banking. The system that made a criminal organizer more effective at protecting tenants than legal tenant associations. Bumpy filled a vacuum created by America's refusal to extend constitutional protections, legal recourse, and basic dignity to black citizens. That's not Bumpy's moral failing, that's America's. In a just system, Bumpy would be a criminal, clear and simple. His actions would be wrong because legal alternatives would exist and work. But in an unjust system, in a system designed to deny legal alternatives, to make justice inaccessible, to force people to choose between legal exploitation and illegal resistance, the moral categories break down. When the system criminalizes survival, is surviving the crime. When legal rent gouging harms more people than illegal gambling, which is the real crime. When police won't protect the community, is criminal protection criminal? When heroes won't show up, can we blame villains for filling the role? These questions don't have clean answers. That's the point. The discomfort we feel trying to categorize Bumpy Johnson is the discomfort we should feel about the system that made someone like Bumpy necessary. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal. That's documented fact. Bumpy Johnson organized community resistance to exploitation. That's community memory. Both things are true. And the tension between them isn't a puzzle to solve. It's a mirror showing us what happens when systems fail so completely that the distinction between criminal and community organizer becomes impossible to maintain. 70 years after Bumpy supposedly organized that rent strike, New York City families face eerily familiar choices. Pay rent or buy food. Pay rent or pay medical bills. Pay rent or keep the heat on. The numbers have changed. Rent is higher, wages relatively lower. But the fundamental equation remains the same. Housing costs that consume half or more of income for families who have nothing left over for emergencies, for savings, for anything beyond survival. Slumlords, then. Individuals, absentee owners, men who bought cheap and extracted maximum profit through minimal maintenance. Slumlords now, corporate landlords, LLCs hiding ownership behind layers of shell companies, algorithms calculating maximum extractable rent before tenant revolt becomes likely. Different mechanisms, same exploitation. Legal system, then. Housing courts sided with landlords, eviction processes favored property rights over human rights, tenant complaints filed and forgotten. Legal system now. Eviction proceedings still favor landlords, legal aid remains chronically underfunded, tenant rights expanded on paper, but enforcement requires resources most tenants don't have. The parallels are uncomfortable. They suggest we learned less than we pretend. Some things did change. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 banned housing discrimination based on race. Tenant protection laws expanded. City housing codes got stricter. Legal aid organizations grew, providing representation to people who couldn't afford lawyers. We got laws. Better laws than existed in the 1950s. But laws without enforcement are just words on paper. And enforcement requires political will. And political will requires power that communities like Harlem still don't fully possess. Housing discrimination became illegal, then went underground. Instead of explicit no blacks policies, landlords use credit checks, income requirements, and application fees to achieve the same exclusionary results. Legal, technically. Discriminatory, functionally. Tenant rights exist, but exercising them requires knowing they exist, having time to fight, accessing legal representation, surviving retaliation. For families living paycheck to paycheck, one missed day of work to appear in housing court can mean catastrophe. What actually changed? The packaging, the rhetoric, the surface mechanisms. What didn't change? The underlying structure of exploitation. Harlem today fights gentrification. Wealthier, whiter newcomers driving up property values, pricing out longtime residents, transforming the cultural landscape. Different displacement mechanism than 1950s slumlords, but displacement nonetheless. And tenants still organize rent strikes. Documented in news coverage from the past few years, buildings in Harlem, in the Bronx, across New York City where tenants collectively withhold rent to force repairs, to protest exploitation, to demand dignity. The tactics echo what Harlem oral histories describe from Bumpy's time. Building by building organizing, strike funds pooling resources to help families who can't afford to withhold rent, solidarity enforcement ensuring everyone holds together. Technology changed the communication methods, WhatsApp groups instead of numbers runners, social media instead of word-of-mouth networks. But the fundamental strategy remains identical: collective action, economic pressure, sustained resistance. 70 years later, tenants still withholding rent to get heat. Different buildings, same battle. Which raises questions we'd rather not answer. Why are we still here? Why hasn't democracy, hasn't the legal system, hasn't the supposed arc of moral progress addressed problems we identified generations ago? Did that rent strike Bumpy organized matter in the long run? Hard to say. History doesn't offer clean causal chains. We can't draw a straight line from one building in 1950s Harlem to contemporary tenant movements. Did it inspire future organizers? Unknown. But Harlem remembered one thing. They had fought back. They could fight back again. That memory, that tradition of resistance, matters even if we can't measure its precise influence. But here's what definitely survived. The problems Bumpy fought. Those didn't just survive. They evolved, adapted, found new forms. Because Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, the structural forces that created the conditions he fought, racism, exploitation, political disenfranchisement, economic extraction, those lived on. Bumpy wasn't the problem. He was a symptom of a system that forces communities to choose between legal exploitation and illegal protection. That system is still operating. We still call people like Bumpy criminals, while calling systemic exploitation the market. We still treat illegal resistance as more threatening than legal oppression. We still act like following unjust laws is more important than challenging them. Maybe that's what hasn't changed. Our comfort with injustice as long as it's legal, our discomfort with justice as long as it's illegal. So this isn't really a story about Bumpy Johnson. It's a story about us, about America, about what we permit, what we punish, what we pretend not to see. When landlords legally charge rents that force families into poverty, push children into substandard schools, deny basic dignity, we shrug. Market forces, supply and demand, property rights. When a gangster illegally organizes a rent strike to get heat for children, to get repairs for families, to challenge exploitation, we call it crime. Which says more about our values? Next time you see headlines about rent strikes, evictions, tenant organizing, ask yourself, why are people still fighting the same battles Bumpy fought 70 years ago? If the system worked, would communities need criminals to protect them? What does it say about America that sometimes the gangster is the only one standing up for working families? I don't have answers. Maybe there aren't clean answers. Maybe the discomfort is the point, because until we're uncomfortable enough with legal injustice to actually change it, we'll keep needing illegal justice to survive it. Somewhere in Harlem tonight, a tenant is deciding whether to pay rent or buy groceries. Somewhere, a landlord is calculating how much rent can be raised before tenants break. And somewhere, maybe someone is organizing resistance, legal or illegal. We probably won't know until it's over. Until history decides which label to apply, which narrative to preserve, which uncomfortable truths to bury. Just like Bumpy's rent strike. We remember the fight, forget who threw the first punch, argue forever about whether resistance was justified or criminal. Maybe both, maybe neither. Maybe the categories themselves are designed to prevent us from asking the real question. Why does the system still need people to choose? This is Harlem Chronicles, where heroes and villains are the same people, where the real crime is the system we refuse to change. Rest in power, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Whatever else you were, you fought for your community when nobody else would. And Harlem remembers.